sometimes when you step back from the day-to-day of politics, even the day-to-day of global politics, you find that there are these kind of meta-narratives that overlay on top of the general events. And one of those is the language, you might say the calling of human rights. It seems to underpin the particular moral universe that so much of the West operates from and within. But I've been wondering, and look, as the various wars of the world splash across our front pages, I'm not the only one wondering, whether its time in the spotlight might be passing, and for what reason. Human rights is a pivotal movement, one that only grew in stature throughout the 20th century until it came to have really quite a significant weight in the way that politics was practiced around the world. But now, today, does it still have that same stature? Does it still have what you might think of as the motivational power it once did? I know this is something my colleague Finbar Anderson, who joins me now, and I have often discussed. Human rights have, to put it mildly, a checkered reputation across the globe, depending on where you're looking from. For many Western countries, to speak frankly, it's been a foreign policy tool first, and then perhaps a second, a distant second, a moral standard, so that that moral standard can look very much like a double standard when it's inconsistently applied. And it's something, Finn, welcome, it's something that you and I have often talked a lot about, but I think you really start to notice it once you started to travel abroad and work abroad.
Hi, Faisal. Yeah, it's great to be on the podcast. Yeah, this is absolutely something that I noticed. As you know, I had a fairly modest career working in a human rights law firm before I began my career as a journalist. So after working in this law firm in London, I moved out to Lebanon, where I chose to work as a journalist. And yet you really see that difference quite starkly when they're juxtaposed in that way. There's those who are kind of doing the preaching. They're preaching about the value of human rights from the West, and that was the position I had initially found myself in. And there are those who are being preached at, I guess. And that was certainly the context that I found myself in later. And I think you don't realize when you're in the West just how inconsistent that moral standard is that you talked about just now, and how much of a double standard it becomes. And that was something that I've never quite been able to shake. And it's something that's really framed my understanding of the whole human rights discourse ever since.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, when you think about the preachers and the preachees, I don't think people disagree about the ideas involved. It's just they disagree about the implementation and who does the implementation and why the people doing the preaching are not also carrying out those obligations.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think this has been a problem that human rights has had to, that the whole human rights movement has had to deal with, and I'm not sure it's dealt with it particularly successfully ever since it gathered steam in the kind of mid-20th century and onwards. And I don't think the human rights movement has ever really been able to work out whether it is this moral ideal that everyone should be really aiming for, or whether it's just a kind of a strategy, a tool, a foreign policy tool. And yeah, that debate is very much alive and strong today, and it's far from over.
It's interesting because I think when you think about it, perhaps the problem of human rights, and I think this is why the conversation with Kenneth Roth is so intriguing, really is not a problem of ideas. It's a problem of political implementation. And this is something that you talk to Kenneth Roth about how do you take this set of ideas and then actually implement them in the real world, which is really a question of politics.
Yeah, so I spoke to Ken for the podcast. He's got this new book, Righting Wrongs. As we discuss, it's as much a kind of textbook as it is a memoir about his time as the executive director of Human Rights Watch. And for anyone who's worked in human rights, Ken Roth is a giant in the field. He was executive director of the organization for a period of almost 2 decades, and seeing it right through the period in which it was coming to its most powerful. And he discussed it just like that. I mean, for him, the way to achieve the goals that they wanted to achieve was in using human rights as a tool, as a strategy. And the kind of moral aspect of it really, it's almost irrelevant to him, not because he doesn't care about it, but because it's just really not useful.
I mean, the time period you're talking about, 93 to 2022, is a very interesting time because it precisely overlaps with the end of the Cold War and then the emergence of one superpower as a global hegemon. And that becomes very intriguing when you think about human rights because, of course, the United States and the West more broadly has talked about human rights, used the language of human rights as a tool of foreign policy.
Yeah, exactly. And you see these fault lines start to appear exactly in that period, in the 90s going through to the early noughties, where they were really propagated, as Ken says in the interview. The human rights discourse was really pushed by Jimmy Carter. And then it took on this whole new identity as we went through Clinton. And then obviously we got to Bush. And that double standard became achingly obvious when you had the war on terror and then Guantanamo and all of these images, which are really impossible to overcome, to get around, I guess.
And what were his core insights for what he thinks the best strategy is for building that accountability in human rights?
Yeah, so he does have fascinating insights. I mean, he was so involved in this organization for so long, and they did have some very tangible successes in persuading various governments to adhere to some particular standard of human rights that they're chasing at the time. And he's got a couple of different tools that he uses. He talks about raising the political cost of not conforming to human rights standards. So it's a very political game almost, where he just makes it embarrassing for a recalcitrant government to not adhere to certain human rights standards. And equally, he enlists the help of friendly, often Western democratic governments to apply pressure. And it very much is as a foreign policy tool. And that first idea that we just spoke about of almost shaming governments, that can be a very powerful one. But you really need that moral standard to be there. And as we've just discussed, that moral standard has been slipping throughout the past decades. And Ken and I spoke about that. And you can hear his conclusions as to where we are at the moment.
It is a compelling idea, and I think it's a world in which both you and I mean, we've existed within it for most of the period when we've been thinking about politics and writing about it and reporting. And yet it is actually at root just an idea. There have been periods of time when human rights have not been as much on the agenda. One of the striking things is that we might be entering that particular period of time right now. You've said to me that it feels to you sometimes like this second term of Trump is a period in which human rights are becoming it's being pushed to the fringes, like a lot of ideas that we thought were with us to stay. What did Ken have to say about that?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I absolutely wanted to put that to Ken. And he acknowledges that the enthusiasm for human rights, it kind of ebbs and flows. But he does say that if you kind of step outside that Trump-centered Western viewpoint, then there have actually been some tangible steps forward for practitioners of human rights in other contexts, and he gives a few examples. And I guess, as he puts it, the alternative is resignation and letting the despots win.
Okay, let's hear it. From me, Faisal Yafai, and my colleague Finbar Anderson, here is this week's episode of The Lead.
Ken Roth, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Your book, Righting Wrongs, it's really as much a handbook as much as anything else. And you've set down what you've learned from your very considerable experience in the field of human rights activism. There is a little bit of insight into Ken Roth, the person. And you remember seeing the first human rights violation that you saw was on television, which I believe was an execution during the Biafran War.
Yes.
So, yeah, tell me how you actually came to be convinced of the importance of human rights. Because back at that time, they weren't really as much a part of the global discourse as they are today.
No, I mean, I think it's fair to say that when I grew up, they were not part of the global discourse. In fact, it wasn't until I was in law school in the late 1970s that Jimmy Carter, the U.S. president, introduced human rights as an element of U.S. foreign policy. That was revolutionary. It was a reaction to, U.S. conduct in the Vietnam War, the atrocities there. It was a reaction to U.S. support for the Pinochet coup in Chile. And President Carter said, I'm going to do it differently. Now, he didn't uniformly do it differently, but it was a step forward. And it was a very exciting moment at a point where I was making career choices. But what really drove me in this direction was the experience of my father, because my father fled Nazi Germany as a young boy. At age 12, he left Frankfurt, Germany in July 1938 and came to New York. And I grew up with stories of what it was like to be a young Jewish boy living under the Nazis, how you had to worry about the brown shirts at the playground bullying you, how we had to worry about, his father, my grandfather, getting arrested. And so I grew up very aware of the evil that governments could do. And I think that's a big part of what set me on the path to try to prevent atrocities of that sort from recurring.
What you're not doing in the book, from the off, you're very clear that you're not applying pressure to governments through your human rights work and through the work of the organization that you led for so many years, Human Rights Watch. You're not applying pressure on them to do what's necessarily morally right. Instead, you describe the need to increase the price of oppression, to shift a government's cost-benefit calculation so that abuse no longer seems as desirable. So tell us about that cost-benefit calculation and why it's more efficient than appealing to what's morally right.
Yeah, well, this goes in a sense to why I wrote the book, because many people, when I would tell them that I defend human rights, they would kind of look at me like, oh, isn't that nice? But you can't really get anything done. And I think it's because they imagined that we sat around and sang Kumbaya and held hands and tried to build broad empathy for human rights victims. And, when you look at the thugs and despots of the world, they're not going to become nice guys. So that's not going to work. And instead, what we had to do at Human Rights Watch is to recognize that people have reasons to violate human rights. It's a way to stay in power. It's a way to get rid of the pesky opposition. And our job was to raise the cost of that repression, to just affect the cost-benefit analysis and make it less profitable to violate human rights. So we weren't trying to conduct some kind of moral conversion of these people. We just wanted to twist their arm, to force them to behave better. And I outline in the book very concretely the sorts of strategies that we use and give lots of examples, lots of stories. So this is not an academic discourse. It is illustrations, time after time, of how it worked. And there are certain basic things that we do all the time. One is that in today's world, every government has to pretend to respect human rights. This is a basic part of their legitimacy. It's a way of telling their people, we're here to serve you, not just ourselves. Now, we know that's not true. And so when Human Rights Watch was able to send investigators to the field and to carefully document the atrocities being committed, we would record those, we would publicize them very broadly, and that was embarrassing. It was shameful. It delegitimized these governments. They hated it. And they would attack us. They would say we were biased, we misunderstood, but we were super careful. So we won those battles over the facts. And ultimately, the despot understood that they couldn't get rid of the bad press without changing the bad conduct. That's when we began to make improvements. Now, the other thing, we did is that we would go to governments that were influential, that claimed to support human rights in their foreign policies. And we would say, would you work with us to put pressure on the target government? And here the premise is that every government wants something from the international community. They want arms sales, they want preferential trade benefits. They sometimes just want to be invited to a fancy summit so they can hang around with respectful leaders and send the photographs to the folks back home and pretend that they're respectful too. Whatever it is, we try to deprive them of that until they change. We really try to raise the diplomatic and economic costs. And you put this together, combined with the possibility sometimes of prosecuting people. And this, forces dictators and autocrats to think twice. And that's when we begin to make progress.
Yeah, I want to pick up on a couple of those points later. But first, your kind of mentor at Human Rights Watch, which was, I think, Helsinki Watch when you first joined, Ayanaya. And you describe him as, the intellectual architect of the methodology that Human Rights Watch came to use. And so I wonder, for many of our listeners, the work of a major human rights organization, perhaps it's not so obvious what actually gets done. So can you describe that methodology that Naya actually pioneered and that you followed up on?
Well, what Ari had us do was not spend a lot of time, protesting on the streets. where you're just another voice don't make any particular difference. He, understood that information can be powerful, and that if we can collect reliable information about government's human rights violations, which we had a whole staff dedicated to doing, we could deploy that in a way where governments felt the pressure. It forced them to change. We could do it in the media. And by the time I left, Human Rights Watch was getting literally 1,000 media citations a day about our work. So we were capable of really shining an intense spotlight on governmental misconduct. And it meant going to the foreign ministries around the world, coming in really as sophisticated policy analysts, recommenders, strategizers, and working with them to put pressure on the target. And so, some of that is behind the scenes. It is not simple work, but it is, completely understandable. And I run through kind of example after example of how this happened in the book.
Yeah. And talk to me as well about the particular use of shame as a tool. You discussed this idea of shame, how it can be a really powerful weapon in your arsenal.
Well, I mean, I deliberately in the book take on the most difficult cases. And so I have a whole chapter on China. And you might say, why does China care? It's this huge country, world's second largest economy, large censorship. Why do they care about their reputation? In fact, Xi Jinping cares enormously about his reputation. Because if you ask Xi Jinping, why are you president of China? He can't say, well, I was freely elected. He has to say, well, the Chinese people want the dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party because we do such a good job of building the economy. And, the huge problem with that is that there's no possibility of the people of China freely expressing themselves. So who knows what they think? And the one place where they could express themselves was Hong Kong. And they came out in the streets in the hundreds of thousands to say they did not want the dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party. So given, that domestic problem of legitimacy, Xi Jinping cares enormously about how the rest of the world treats him. That's why China so vehemently retaliates against anybody who criticizes it, will cut off their access to the Chinese market. It's why when Human Rights Watch tried to put China's treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang on the agenda of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, Xi Jinping personally got on the phone and called other heads of state, urging them to vote with China. We ended up losing that vote by 2 votes. It was very close. But it shows the enormous attention that China places on its reputation, the power that Xi can have, even in a place like China.
To follow up on that, there's a particular moment in the book as well. You remember this trip to Libya when you were actually invited by Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, and you present these findings. You find a certain number of political prisoners who are being held in pretty terrible conditions in jails, and you're advocating that they should be released. And when you present these findings to these mid-level officials, they're pretty furious.
They started yelling at us. Yes.
And I wonder, is it the fact that whenever you take these findings to governments, to officials within governments, do they always feel that they're being presented with some kind of outrageous slight upon their morality, or that they're being singled out? This does seem to be a kind of a constant.
It's a theme, yes. No, I mean, look, everybody says, why are you picking on me? And of course, we don't just pick on them. Human Rights Watch covered about 100 governments around the world. But the Libya example is very powerful because, Muammar Gaddafi was trying to clean up his act because he wanted international investment in Poland. And so he stopped supporting terrorism and he dismantled his nuclear program and he paid off the victims of the Lockerbie bombing. But his big problem was his human rights record. So he was willing for Human Rights Watch to go into his prisons. And the only condition was that we report our findings to the Gaddafi government before making them public. So I went to Tripoli. And as you know, I met with these mid-level officials who started yelling at us. You got this completely wrong. How could you do this? You can't possibly publish this. And so I let them go on for a little bit. And then I said, look, guys, you don't understand. We are releasing this report a few days from now at a press conference in Cairo. And the journalists are going to ask us, how were your meetings in Tripoli? We can say they were awful. All they did was yell at us. Or we could say they were productive. They promised the following reforms. Which should it be? And at that point, they kind of looked uncomfortably at each other and said, we got to consult with our superiors. They dismissed us for the day. Next day, they called us back. It was a different government. They were all smiles. They had this stack of folders on their desk with all the cases that we wanted to look at. And we had given them a list of 171 political prisoners, all of whom were very quickly released. And that just shows, the kind of the power of information. we were able to speak to them honestly because dictators surround themselves with sycophants. Dictators don't hear the truth very often. One of my jobs was to walk in and tell them the truth. What are they going to do to me? And so that was a very important part of these meetings. We obviously deal with the media. We change their public reputation. But sometimes the most important thing we do is just go to the leader and say, this is the reality. Nobody's telling you this, but this is what's happening, and you better change.
Yeah, and so you mentioned just a couple of minutes back, you mentioned that one of the other ways that you operate is not just going to governments like the Libyan government, for example, but also you'll work with those that consider themselves democracies, whether it's France or Germany or the United States, for example, UK, and these governments might be using human rights as a kind of foreign policy tool to fulfill certain aspects of their own agenda. And this is quite a key point of difference that Human Rights Watch has with some of its contemporaries, with other advocacy groups in the field, over whether or not you should be engaging with governments that consider themselves democratic like this in a kind of mutually beneficial relationship. Amnesty International, for example, was one of the groups saying that you shouldn't do this a decade or two back. Can you outline that disagreement for me?
Sure. I mean, what some felt is that because the international order is unjust, because it's not necessarily fair that some governments are so much more powerful than others, that it's wrong for the human rights movement to play on that power imbalance and go to a powerful government and to say, help us improve the lives of people in this country where the government is less powerful. Now, my view was, yes, it's unfortunate that the world is unjust, but if I can use that power dynamic to get people out of prison, to stop summary executions, to stop torture, I'm going to do that. And I'm just going to do whatever I can to prevent this very concrete suffering. I give a very concrete example. I open the book with this, and that is the situation in Idlib in northwestern Syria, which was the last part of Syria held by the armed opposition. And Syria and Russian planes were deliberately bombing civilians and institutions. So they were bombing hospitals and markets, schools, apartment buildings. We wanted this to stop. We carefully documented it. Assad, at that point, the Syrian president, had no reputation left. This is a guy who already had used chemical weapons against his people. He had barrel bombed them. He had tortured and disappeared tens of thousands. So we couldn't shame Assad. But Putin at that stage, and this was before his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, did care about his reputation. Now, we couldn't go to Washington in that case. Trump was in office. Trump was not going to pressure Putin. So we went to Merkel in Germany, Macron in France, and Erdogan in Turkey. And we pressed them to press Putin to stop bombing civilians in Idlib. And it took 2 to 3 years, but finally, in March 2020, Putin agreed, the bombing stopped, and 3 million civilians sitting near Idlib suddenly didn't have to worry about death from the skies. And it picked up a little bit after 3 years, but basically it ended definitively because Idlib is where the HTS rebel group came from that this past December overthrew Assad. So it was a huge difference for the people of Syria. And, yes, there is an unfair power imbalance here. Yes, Putin cared about, Merkel and Macron because he wanted trade with Europe and the like, but that was good for the people of Idlib and made an enormous difference in terms of saving lives. So I feel very positive about deploying that power imbalance for the benefit of these people.
Yeah, I want to consider that from the perspective of some of these democratic governments, for example, who have been far from perfect in their application of human rights around the world. And I think this is a really key point. So you write in the book that the key to changing the conduct of governments is pushing them to live up to widely shared moral standards. And these cooperative governments, they might say one thing on foreign policy, for example, as part of their agenda, say they're pushing an agenda of human rights, but they might be doing another thing domestically, for example. These governments are inevitably going to become the spokespeople for the human rights movement for these moral standards, if they are the ones advocating for them on the kind of global stage. And I lived myself for a long time outside of the West, and where I was living, people could see it looked instead like a double standard. So they're being told one thing by, for example, an American ambassador, while that same government is shipping off one of their fellow citizens to a US black site in Diego Garcia or Guantanamo Bay or somewhere like that. And so this strategy of, allowing these Western governments to collaborate, cooperate with you in this kind of symbiotic relationship, doesn't it kind of hamper the global adoption, the global take-up of this widely shared moral standard that's so important to your work?
I mean, you're completely right to point out the double standard that infects essentially every government's foreign policy. And this is certainly true of the US government. It's true of European governments. And these governments would, of course, have much more credibility if they adhered to human rights standards in a consistent, principled way. They don't. So our response to that is really twofold. I mean, one is we press them to be more consistent. So when Trump closes his eyes to massive war crimes in Gaza, we try to hit him hard for that. We try to change that part of U.S. foreign policy. But at the same time, even these compromised voices can be significant. They're the votes at the UN Human Rights Council that we need to establish, I described at one point the monitoring mechanism we established over the Saudi-led coalition's bombing of Yemeni civilians. And because we were able to rally enough votes there, we curtailed the civilian casualties. When that oversight mechanism was lifted 4 years later, the civilian casualties doubled. So even though, many of the people voting with us did have compromised human rights records, we were still able to do some good. So, we just have to do the best we can in an imperfect world. I wished everybody was an angel. They're not. But we do the best we can working with the power out there to try to make things better for people suffering repression.
I want to follow that up with a question about building a global coalition, building a global movement for human rights. And you say in the book that it's necessary, in order to persuade a government that they should comply with human rights, it's necessary that there is some kind of moral standard that feels that these are a good thing, essentially. So you say in the book that even when abuses are popular with one audience, for example, a far-right leader's base, those same acts may remain shameful with others. For example, city dwellers are often more rights-orientated than rural residents, as an example. But on this podcast just last week, my colleague Danny Postel described how the Democrats in the US have come to be seen as this party of elites, of the college-educated coastal elites and liberals who sneer at ordinary working-class people who speak a different language. And if your strategy for building a human rights coalition is going to rely on appealing specifically to, for example, city dwellers, aren't human rights practitioners going to fall into a similar trap of being seen as out of touch, this kind of coastal elite and speaking in a lexicon that isn't relevant or understood by the majority of people?
Yeah. Well, let me sort of take a step back and explain how I think we are able to shame. And as I describe in the book, while human rights are codified in international treaties, that's not what's decisive. That gives us legitimacy. If I walk in and, make a presentation to a government and they say, who are you? I just say, look, I'm upholding these treaties that you ratified. So that's a basic legitimacy point. But if I shine a spotlight on governmental conduct and people look at it and say, that's not so bad, I don't shame them. I don't move them. And that's why, in essence, what matters is not some treaty I can cite, but people's sense of right and wrong. I've got to persuade people that this governmental conduct is wrong. Now, the people I have to persuade are not everybody in the country. I don't have to go to the deepest Trump supporter. We can focus on the movable middle. And Western countries are so divided, if you get 55% of the people on your side, you can move government policy. And so, those are the people I think about. I don't focus, is it rural or urban? I focus on just, can we build a slight majority around this pro-rights policy so the government feels compelled to follow it. And we have successfully done that in a lot of different situations. But even if a country is very closed or an autocrat is been able to make his repression popular, take what Viktor Orban does in Hungary, and he's made persecution of immigrants popular or persecution of gays popular. There are still other tools to use. Viktor Orban wanted these huge subsidies he received every year from the European Union because he used that money to pay off his cronies. He was very corrupt. And so we were able to condition those subsidies on an improvement to Orban's human rights practices, because even if Orban had made this repression popular in Hungary, it was not popular in the European Union as a whole. So sometimes you have to find your relevant audience, and so long as it has influence over the target government, it can make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, you read your book, your career. It's astonishing, the number of successes that you had across a long and extremely successful career. And the inference that you can draw, and that I think you do draw, is that you consider all of these successes in the aggregate, and they're kind of indicative of a general trend towards a greater respect for and appreciation for human rights. But your book and the events that you're talking about describe this period post Jimmy Carter, where human rights are trending upwards, so trending up to being much more of a part of the global lexicon. But mightn't it be the case that this was? I mean, you look at the age that we're in now, and do you not think that it could just be the case that you were operating within a kind of a golden era for human rights, and that age is now moving on?
Well, one thing I point out in the book is that there are always ebbs and flows in respect for human rights. Was very involved initially during the Soviet period when it looked like repression was just immutable. Then suddenly it fell. There was this moment of freedom. That was a positive moment. Then things started falling apart with the ethnic clashes in the former Yugoslavia, the genocide in Rwanda. It looked very bleak. We were able to finally secure justice in those cases. Then we had 9/11 and Bush's counterterrorism policies where he was torturing people and throwing them in Guantanamo. So that was a downside. So we've seen these ebbs and flows. We are clearly in a dark side in the West in the sense that we're seeing, Trump in power, the AfD threatening in Germany, Marine Le Pen a force in France, the Reform Party of Farage, a significant factor in the UK. But if you look at the world, people who live under autocrats almost uniformly want out. And we've seen the evidence of that in these huge demonstrations that occur in country after country where people are seeking democracy. They're opposed to autocracy. And sometimes they work. So, recently we got rid of Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh. We got rid of the Rajapaksa dynasty in Sri Lanka. In South Korea, there was this very popular effort to stop a coup by the president. In Poland, the people voted out the Law and Justice Party. In Brazil, they voted out Bolsonaro. So there are moments when we actually win. There are other times when the repressive forces are just too ruthless to overcome at the moment. Iran, Russia, Belarus, Nicaragua, Uganda. But it's clear where the people stand. So I don't think that we should be blinded by what are clear problems in the West and presume that they're global, because they're not. And most of the world has a very different view. In the West, I think we have learned that Western democracies have not been adequately attentive to a major segment of society that feels left behind. They feel that they're economically stagnating. They're facing growing inequality. They feel the government doesn't speak to them, doesn't respect them, doesn't serve them. And that is a weakness. These are the people who are ripe for the autocrat's appeal. I think the job of those who want democracy to survive in the West is to push it to better represent everybody, and at the same time fight back against this autocratic sleight of hand where they demonize immigrants or demonize LGBT people, but are not really serving the working class people they claim to be serving. They're serving themselves. And so I think pro-democracy forces in the West have some cleaning up to do, but we shouldn't presume from these troubles in the West that we've lost the human rights battle, because in most of the world, we're actually in a very different place. And I think we could even be in a very different place in the West if the proper lessons are learned from this recent autocratic turn.
For you, Ken, I wonder what's a better future if this human rights movement is part of a progression towards a kind of better future, a progressive future. What does that look like for you? Because it does feel like we're at this critical time. We're at a moment of a lot of change. And I mean, I'm thinking particularly of what's happening in some of these major international courts, the ICJ, the ICC, the fact we've got, for the first time, major Western allies have had arrest warrants issued against them in the International Criminal Court. Do you think that this speaks to greater accountability going forward? But equally, it's been Western allies who have actually tried to undermine many of those actions discussions at the same time. Germany, for example, was saying, Germany's leaders said that if Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, for example, were to come to Germany, then they didn't see a way in which it would be possible to arrest him under the terms of those ICC arrest warrants. So on the one hand, you're looking at greater accountability for leaders who have violated human rights, but on the other hand, it's continuing to be eroded by the same powers who are supposed to be helping to enforce those rights.
Well, let me just, as a preliminary matter, say that one of the important points I make in the book is that the struggle for human rights is perennial. You can't just say, oh, we want, I'm going to go home and relax. It's not like that. Governments are always tempted to violate human rights. The human rights movement always needs to push back. That's just life. Now, with the emergence of international justice, to put this in perspective, I mean, I described in the book when I started, there was no option of international justice. The most you could hope for was a truth commission that would describe what happened. So today we do have the International Criminal Court. In its early years, it was criticized for only focusing on sub-Saharan Africa. That's over with now. It is charged Putin, it's charged Netanyahu. It has in custody Duterte, the former Philippine president. It is seeking charges against the Myanmar junta chief, again, senior Taliban leaders. So it is becoming a global justice institution. The difficulty we do have is that some governments are not principled. The U.S. loved it when the ICC charged Putin, and then Trump imposed sanctions on the ICC prosecutor for charging Netanyahu. That's utterly unprincipled. I mean, there's no excuse for that whatsoever. Germany, which is one of the founding states of the ICC, played a very important role in Rome when the ICC was being negotiated and fended off this U.S. view that justice shouldn't apply to Americans. But Germany is now applying a double standard to Israel. And I think that this is, frankly, Germany drawing the wrong lesson from the Holocaust. It should make a special effort to protect Jews, given the Holocaust. But that requires defending human rights standards. Instead, what the German government is doing is they're defending the Netanyahu government, the Israeli far-right government, regardless of what it does, even when it's ripping up the Geneva Conventions, even when it's undermining human rights standards. And if you start making an Israel exception to human rights standards today, tomorrow there'll be an exception for somebody else. That is not a system where Jews or anybody else are safe. And so I just think that the German government, and this is, illustrative of this broader problem toward Israel, has got to get past this view that the right answer to the Holocaust is utter deference to the Israeli government, regardless of its atrocities. The right answer to the Holocaust is to defend the human rights standards that would make more atrocities of that sort unthinkable against anyone.
Ken, I want to bring this to a close by quoting you again from the book. You write, knowing that real change is possible, that the perennial skeptics are wrong, encourages people to help make that change happen. And you look at the world at the moment, there's ongoing conflicts. It seems that there are new ones just around the corner. And so you can understand where those perennial skeptics are coming from. I mean, there are so many examples of human rights abuses that aren't being rectified. And sometimes it feels like we haven't learned the correct lessons from, for example, the horrors of the early 20th century. But I want to give you the last word. So convince the perennial skeptics that they're wrong and that real change is possible and that they can bring it about. How would you do that?
Well, I opened the book by quoting Dr. Martin Luther King and his often cited phrase, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I note that that's actually not true. There's nothing inevitable about things bending toward justice. And indeed, Dr. King admitted as much in the exact same speech a little bit later, but nobody cites the other part, where he says, but actually what you need is a concerted defense. Nothing ever happens without people mobilizing and pressing forward. And so, yes, there are always going to be governments who violate human rights. This is how they stay in power. This is how they grasp on to the things that they want, the corruption, etc. And so the only way to stop that is to push back. But I hope that people gather from the book, given the many, many examples I give of successfully pushing back, that this is doable. It doesn't mean that you should just kind of win a victory and go home. It means you got to keep fighting. But we should keep fighting because I hope I've shown it's possible to win. And you win today, you have to keep fighting tomorrow. That's life. But you can make a huge difference. The alternative is resignation, just letting the despots win. I don't think that's the world any of us should want.
Ken Roth, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines magazine. Kenneth Roth's book, Righting Wrongs, 3 Decades on the Front Lines Battling Abusive Governments, is out now and available online and in all good bookstores. This week's episode was produced and hosted by Finbar Anderson. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.